Salman Rushdie ist erkältet. Kein Wunder. Seit 3 Monaten tourt er um die Welt, um sein neues Buch vorzustellen. 2 Jahre, 8 Monate und 28 Nächte. Macht zusammen 1001 Nacht. Ein fantastischer Roman, prall gefüllt mit orientalischen Mythen und amerikanischer Fantasy. Ich bin ein großer Fan von Superhelden-Blockbuster-Filmen. Ich bin in Indien groß geworden, wissen Sie, und meine erste Berührung mit der westlichen Kultur waren Comichefte. Ich habe Comics regelrecht verschlungen und wurde ein großer Experte. Bis heute kann ich Ihnen erklären, was der Unterschied zwischen grünem und rotem Kryptonit ist. Das ist schwierig. Nun, von mystischem Gestein handelt Rushdies Fabel nicht, dafür von einem New York nach der Naturkatastrophe. Durch den Sturm kommen böse Djinns in den Big Apple, Geisterwesen, deren einziger Antrieb es ist, Angst zu verbreiten und die Erde ins Chaos zu stürzen. Das klingt wie eine Metapher für den sogenannten IS und seinen Terror. Ich habe vor etwa 4 Jahren angefangen, das Buch zu schreiben. Damals hat niemand das Wort IS gekannt. Es fühlt sich seltsam an, auf einmal so richtig zu liegen. Ich habe maßlos übertrieben, um etwas Fabelhaftes zu schaffen, ein Märchen eben. Und plötzlich hat mich die Realität eingeholt. Auch nach den Anschlägen in Paris ist Rushdie überzeugt, westliche Gesellschaften dürfen nicht aus Angst ihre Lebensart und Offenheit aufgeben oder Werte wie die Meinungsfreiheit einschränken. Ich bin sehr stolz auf die Menschen von Paris und wie sie reagiert haben. Sie haben eben nicht mit Rache reagiert und auch nicht mit Bitterkeit gegen Unschuldige. Es gibt diesen wundervollen Hashtag, ich bin im Restaurant. Nach Ich bin Charlie ist das eine wunderbar geistvolle Art zu sagen, wir werden weiterhin Pariser bleiben mit all unserer Lebenslust. Lange musste er selbst Angst um sein Leben haben. 1989 hat der Iran eine Fatwa verhängt. Rushdie sollte umgebracht werden, weil er den Propheten verunglimpft hatte. Mehr als 10 Jahre lebte der Schriftsteller unter Polizeischutz. Die einzige Art für mich damals weiterzumachen, war, mir treu zu bleiben und bloß nicht von Angst oder Wut mich beherrschen zu lassen. Ich wusste, entweder schreibe ich dann nur noch angstvolle Bücher oder eben Romane, die von Rache geprägt sind. Und beides hätte mich als Künstler zerstört. Rushdie hat sich durch die Fatwa nicht kleinkriegen lassen. Er nennt die Dinge weiterhin beim Namen und ist ein begnadeter Geschichtenerzähler mit Geist und Witz. Davon lebt auch sein Roman, in dem die bösen Djinns übrigens nicht siegen. Das konnte ein Genussmensch wie Rushdie der Erde dann doch nicht antun.
In a German review, I read I think, fantastic phrase about your book. The author said your novel is as if Kafka has written a superhero blockbuster movie.
Oh, that's very flattering. But it is true that Kafka had something to do with the beginning of this novel, because, I'm very interested in the subject of metamorphosis. And I think one of the things I wanted to show is that this is a world in the middle of a radical metamorphosis. What is called the time of the strangenesses of the book. But I think we live in such a time, in which everything is changing overnight. And, so it's changing very radically, but it's also changing at high speed.
Yeah, at high speed, that's it.
And so, the first bit of the novel that I had to write about was the story of Mr. Geronimo the gardener who levitates. And for a while I thought maybe this is a little Kafka story. This is about somebody to whom a random alteration happens that is not explained. It just is so. And then he has to come to terms with it, and so does everybody else around him, in the way that Gregor Samsa has to deal with it, and so does his family in the metamorphosis. So I thought maybe this is my little Kafka story, but then it grew outwards from there. I think I've always been interested in science fiction, and science fiction used to be in books, and then it was in very cheap B-movies, and then ever since Star Wars, it's become this kind of like dominant form of the commercial cinema, and yeah, I thought if you're going to write a book which contains conflict between supernatural beings and human beings, it naturally leads you towards thinking about things like Star Wars you know, etc. Because that's where you see those things, you know. So yes, this is my Star Wars movie.
The story starts with the philosopher Ibn Rushd, and there is a very special connection to you. I mean, to your name.
Well, it's my dad. I mean, my father was an admirer of his, of Averroes, Ibn Rushd. And such an admirer that he changed our family name, which is an extreme thing to do.
Yeah,
you know,
really?
you know, really. I mean, he's my father. I couldn't argue with him. And actually, I didn't even know about it as a child growing up. I just thought that's our name. You know? It was puzzling that my grandfather didn't have the same name as my father. You know? But when you're a kid, you accept whatever. You know. And I mean, I guess when I was old enough to be going to college, I was told this story. And so then I, of course, became very interested in him. And when I was at university, I read some of his work. And I thought, you know, I get it. He's a very attractive philosopher. You know, in the 12th century, he was one of the most progressive voices, you know, of that time. And his ideas afterwards were enormously important for people like St. Thomas Aquinas, and very, very important for the Italian Renaissance humanist philosophers, you know, etc. So he's a colossal figure. And so I got it. But then the bizarre thing was that this was when I was 20 years old. You know, that I read. So then when you skip forward, you know, another decade, another 2 decades, you know, and after the publication of the Satanic Verses, when there was this attack on my work, I realized that his work had been attacked in a very similar way. That, you know, he had the fanatics of his time opposing him. And he lost his job. I mean, he was the court philosopher and the court physician. He was driven out of town into exile, and he had his books burned. And I thought, you know, I know something about this. And I thought, how does my father foretell this?
Yeah.
My father was dead by then. And I thought, how amazing.
What a coincidence.
It's astonishing.
It looks like fate.
Yes. And so obviously at that point, I became extra interested in him. And I always thought, you know, one of these days, he is going to find his way into a book of mine.
The book talks about a world that is radically and very fast changing, but also it talks about this constant conflict between reason and faith. Don't you think also, in a way, that's the same situation we live in, the same conflict we experience?
Yes, I mean, you know, obviously, because, you know, when you set out, as I did, to write a very contemporary book, you know, that was my brief to myself, is that never mind about all this flying carpets and genies. Really, you're writing a book about now, you know, and that's why the New York City in the book is supposed to represent a very recognizable New York City of this moment, you know, and it's full of little references to things that happen in New York, you know, now. And I wanted it to be that, and of course, on the larger sort of world historical scale, yes, it does. Obviously, the book is aware of the conflict that is taking place in the world, you know, and I have to say, what is very strange is that the book was aware of it before it happened, because, you know, when I started writing this book was like 4 years ago. 4 years ago, nobody had heard the word ISIS, you know. 4 years ago, ISIS was a goddess in Egypt. You know?
These attacks in Europe are the same disruption for Europe as 9/11 for the United States. Do you think so too?
I think it might be a moment like that. Yeah, I think it might be a moment like that.
Do you think Europe or France or Germany or whatever has done something wrong?
No, I think this is the great mistake of Western liberals is to immediately try to take the blame.
You think so?
Yes. Somebody comes and shoots your mother and you say, oh, it's my fault.
That's a liberal position?
Yes. It's endlessly, this is because we did this. You know, this has happened because we did that. And I'm so sick of that. You know, my view is this is not our fault. This is the fault of the killers. You know, murder is the fault of the murderer.
Not the victim.
Not the victim.
Yeah.
And you put it like this, if supposing I'm an incredibly annoying person and I annoy you every day profoundly, I'm rude to you, I'm discourteous, you know, I kick your dog, you know, I'm an asshole. You kill me, you're still a murderer. My being an asshole does not excuse you from being a murderer, you know. And it's the same thing here. It may well be that there are things that Western governments have done that are very annoying and angering and upsetting, to people in other parts of the world, but they're still the murderers, and the criminal is guilty of the crime, and nobody else is. So a murderer can't stand up in court and say, yeah, but he was a real asshole. That's not admissible in evidence. So that's what I'm saying. I think that there's some kind of strange quirk in the liberal mind, which makes people want to take responsibility.
But that's a very interesting and good opinion, and that's true. The world has experienced Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, but I think the ISIS is a new dimension of terror. Would you agree? And what is different?
Well, the great difference is that this is the first time that the jihad has had an army.
A real army.
A real army, an actual army, which is recruiting quite successfully from all over the world.
From Western world as well. I mean,
from Australia,
France,
from Canada, from France,
Belgium.
from England, from Belgium. And I mean, the numbers are all a little bit spurious and suspect, but it does seem as if, maybe as many as 5,000 to 10,000 people have joined this force from outside Iraq and Syria, and that's a very alarming thing, that there's this army growing. And then, of course, it controls a piece of land which is rich in natural resources, and it has a lot of oil, and that's again a new thing, So yeah, it's a very powerful thing, but I have to say, the fact that it's very powerful doesn't make it irresistible. I had a friend, journalist, who was recently in the area, and he wrote, I thought, an interesting thing. He said that the impression he formed was that ISIS, that they're very good terrorists and they're very bad soldiers. So if you're actually talking about them as an army, they're not that much of an army, which also makes them defeatable. And I think what you already see is, the Kurdish, the Peshmerga fighters are doing quite well against them, and we'll see. Yesterday, whenever it was, there was a United Nations resolution, which is the first time that there's been a completely unequivocal, no dissenters United Nations resolution saying the world has to fight this. You make a lot of enemies, in the end, you've got a problem. And the thing about ISIS is it has no friends.